And I use that professional lens to do that.
So you did interview him, correct?
4 times, yes, sir.
4 times, but you did not do what you call a formal evaluation?
Formal testing. I didn't administer psychometric tests, no, sir.
And so you talked earlier about your specialty of neuroscience, did I understand that?
Neuropsychology, yes, sir.
Neuropsychology, which is a subfield of psychology.
Yes.
And today you're going to give testimony regarding that neuropsychology as it relates to your interview of the defendant?
I think that's a reasonable statement. Primarily going to be talking about brain-behavior relationships. I'm going to be looking at his history relative to brain maturation and things that happen to him that have significance to his functioning.
And so you're going to talk about the way his brain is right now based upon events that have happened to him in his life.
I don't know if I would take it that far.
How far would you take it?
Well, I'm going to be talking about the neuropsychological history that he has experienced, those things in his history that are of neuropsychological significance that may shed light on the events that took place.
And this is going to be based on things he's told you, correct?
Well, no, not entirely. I had a lot of collateral material to review.
Can you tell me everything you reviewed?
Yes, sir, I can. I had school. Generally, or how much detail do you?
Just saying school records is sufficient. You don't have to tell me every school.
Okay, all right, that's fine. I had some medical records. I had his school records.
I'm sorry, what medical records?
I had medical records that related to his care at Brackenridge Hospital when he had a suicide attempt. I had basically all the TCSO materials. I had, of course, some of the things that are involved in this litigation.
Like the offense report?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And the grand jury testimonies. And that's predominantly what I have. I think that's pretty much it.
Anything else provided to you by the defense attorneys?
No.
Okay, no other outside material?
No.
I don't have any objection now.
Dr. Harrell, I believe you were describing your educational background.
I think I did that. I think we were talking about my work history.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I lost my place.
Or what I do for a living.
Okay, so you did postdoctoral work with Baylor College of Medicine, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, what you do for a living is?
Primarily do neuropsychological evaluations, psychological evaluations, and life care planning. I think we talked a little bit about that a minute ago. Basically taking a neurological injury, such as a traumatic brain injury or a spinal cord injury, and trying to figure out what the medical and medically related goods and services are that are needed in order to take care of someone for the remainder of their life.
So when you say goods and services, is that sort of a civil law context? If a person's injured and they need to know what kind of care they're going to have going forward, what's going to cost, and that type of thing. Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
So you commonly work in civil law cases where there's been a traumatic injury, car wreck, or something like that?
That's a fair statement, yes, sir.
What about criminal law cases? Did you ever work in criminal cases?
No.
Is this your very first criminal case?
Yes, sir.
And why personally, is it that you were interested in getting involved in a criminal law case when that's not normally what you do?
Of course, I've done a lot of second guessing about that. I don't.
Objectives irrelevant why he personally wanted to get involved in the case.
Your Honor, it's very relevant because his motivation for testifying is certainly something that a jury can evaluate. So, Dr. Harrell, did you agree to get involved in this case because you're some kind of anti-death penalty advocate? I'll ask you that way.
No.
Then, did your interest in getting involved in this case?
Objection lead.
Your Honor, I haven't even asked a question.
You're telling him your question.
Did your interest in getting involved in this case have any relation to your professional career and what you do as a neuropsychologist?
Yes.
And in what way?
Well, for me personally, I was trying to make sense out of a fundamentally senseless act and trying to come to understand it.
All right. And is it from that lens that you were talking about?
Yes, from my point of view.
Okay. What do you mean by that, your point of view?
As I said earlier, my professional work is predominantly in the area of neuropsychology, which is a subspecialty that deals with brain-behavior relationships. And typically that sheds light on human development. And it sheds light on some of the maladaptive behavior that is sometimes evident in a criminal situation, one involving murder. In this particular case, there's also the comorbid or the other factor of chronic substance and drug abuse, which typically reflects some underlying psychopathology such as depression or bipolar disorder, some untreated other psychiatric conditions. So I was curious from a professional standpoint, and it was the first time I'd ever been asked, and in some ways I felt like it was a professional contribution to the community.
And so back to your sort of professional background, how long is it that you've been doing what you do?
29 years.
And have you worked on both children and adults and adolescents?
Yes, although the majority of our evaluations are with children and adolescents. I do work at a neuropsychiatric hospital where we will do somewhere between 150 and 300 evaluations a year.
And is that on just children, or is it children and adults? Or?
Children and adolescents, yes, sir.
You had indicated earlier that one of the areas that you're interested in is the polysubstance abuse. And of course, there's been some testimony to the jury about polysubstance abuse. Can you explain what that means and how that relates to your professional background?
Basically, polysubstance just means that someone has got an abusive pattern and they're using indiscriminately almost various substances. From my point of view as a neuropsychologist, it was of interest to me. It piqued my curiosity because we see a very high incidence of substance use under two circumstances. One is someone who's got a history of traumatic brain injury. There's a very high incidence of a substance use disorder that evolves after that. And as I alluded to earlier, it's also the case, at least with my professional experience, the population that I've seen, I have never treated anyone that had a substance use disorder that when that wasn't addressed, it didn't reveal an underlying psychiatric condition that was untreated. And that's what I mean.
Okay. And so you've talked about there being some level of traumatic brain injury in this case. I believe you mentioned that earlier. What's your background in evaluating traumatic brain injury?
That's a long story. I basically got interested in neuropsychology because of the field of traumatic brain injury. In large part, it was emerging. There were a lot of things that were changing from a care standpoint when I was undergoing my graduate level and postdoctoral work. And from my point of view, it was very interesting because I personally sustained a concussion that was pretty significant. It altered my behavior for a period of time. And it's the most common neurological problem that we see in our society, a concussion or a brain injury of some form.
So what exactly is a concussion or a brain injury? Explain that to me.
It's defined as a blunt force trauma to the head that results in an alteration in mental status for a period of time. It's typically characterized by retrograde amnesia or loss of memory for events before the accident itself, and then a period of confusion or disorientation, typically characterized by an alteration in mental status after the event. And sometimes it involves what we refer to as anterograde amnesia, which is a loss of memories that persist of some form of memory or concentration focus deficit. While all of it's a common problem, and while the majority of people don't have long-term consequences, what happens oftentimes if it happens at the wrong time in development, if it happens multiple times during critical formative years, then it can express itself permanently in someone.
So what do you mean by these critical formative years?
What I mean by that is our early developmental years. The frontal areas of the brain are really sort of the last areas of the brain to start working and be fully operational. When someone has an injury early on in their development, it can derail normal wiring up of the frontal lobes. And people who have multiple concussive events tend to have a degree of behavioral instability. They tend to have a degree of disinhibition. They tend to be more prone to mood instability. And so if you see those patterns occurring early on in development, multiple concussive events, you raise the likelihood or the risk factors for having changes in or alterations in the functioning of the frontal lobes. And so that becomes significant for me.
You also, I think, have indicated that adolescence is an important developmental time period.
Well, there's two real critical periods. One is the very initial phases of growth and development. Frontal lobes, you can see children as their frontal lobes are beginning to get myelinated and plugged in. You can see a child, for example, everybody knows not to put your finger in a 110 outlet. As children's frontal lobes are beginning to myelinate and they're beginning to use language to inhibit their own behavior, you might see them look at you and begin to walk over to the 110 outlet and say no, 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 but their frontal lobes aren't fully myelinated, so they walk over and put their finger in the plug while they're saying no. Well, obviously, if you're injured early on, that's going to delay that wiring up, as it were, and it may derail it a little bit to one degree or another. Brandon, in particular, had an injury that was significant at the 18 to 24 month period, maybe up to the age of 3. We're not real certain because there's no records to describe it, but he had an injury to his head where he fell in the bathtub, significant enough that the family took him to the hospital, and he was noted to have bruising and a knot on his head for a pretty long period of time thereafter. So that was the very first one that I was aware of that was of significance to me.
Dr. Harrell, can you explain to the jury what
Courses. I asked Brandon in one of my interviews about any events that he was aware of where he might have had a blow to the head.
Hold on just a second. So, are you saying that he related to you this event from when he was 18 months old?
No, actually, he knows it as a story that's in his family.
Okay. So he's relating some hearsay to you that somebody else told him that happened when he was 18 months old.
Well, that's how all of us would learn about 18 months.
Oh, you could ask your parents about 18 months.
Right.
You didn't do that, did
I
you?
did not know, sir.
So what you're relating is what Brandon Daniel told you. He claimed somebody told him about an injury that occurred when he was 18 months old.
That's right.
Don't I object to him relying on any kind of hearsay from the defendant about something that happened when he was 18 months old?
Your Honor, the rules specifically state that experts can rely on hearsay in developing their opinions. And additionally, the expert said there was Dr. Harrell, what was your second source?
Well, it came up in a, I don't really recall exactly where it came up, but I had noted it in my timeline that I developed, that was a significant event that had been related. The other event was he obtained his first motorcycle at the age of 3. It had training wheels, but it still was a motorized vehicle, and there were multiple discussions about or reports of accidents that required medical attention. But Brandon related another incident. He doesn't know how old he was. Brandon actually does not have a lot of personal memories of his childhood like you and I might, which was significant to me. And he has noted that about himself. But he recalls riding a bicycle and having an accident where he ran into a parked car and was knocked unconscious for a period of time. That also has resulted in a laceration to his head and required medical treatment. All of these things occurred in very early periods of his development.
Let me stop you. You know, lots of children get bumps and bruises. Is this different than children just getting bumps and bruises?
Anytime someone loses consciousness, and anytime there's an alteration in mental status surrounding blunt force trauma to the head, it's a significant event. We oftentimes will talk about it as minor, and that's by definition, but minor has no relationship whatsoever to the potential functional consequences of that injury. It merely is talking about the severity of the traumatic. Anytime there's an alteration in mental status surrounding blunt force trauma to the head, it's a significant event. We oftentimes will talk about it as minor, and that's by definition, but minor has no relationship whatsoever to the potential functional consequences of that injury. It merely is talking about the severity of the traumatic brain injury.
Okay. And did you indicate that having multiple brain injuries to the same area have a compounding effect?
It does. It absolutely does. We're gaining more and more insight about it, and as you know, the NFL just had a big they basically worked with the Players Association to come to a settlement in a lawsuit that involves multiple concussive events, and we're becoming more and more aware of these chronic traumatic encephalopathies that occur.
Do you have other information about Brandon having suffered from these kinds of?
Probably the most significant one to me was one that he could give me a very clear description of, but it was also referred to in records. And that was a skateboard accident that occurred when he was possibly age 15 or 14, sometime in that time period. He was knocked unconscious for an extended period of time. Brandon, and the way we determine these things is we do what's referred to as retrospective questioning. You're trying to get very clear understanding of what the last memory was before the event happened and what the first memory they had after the accident. And in discussing that with Brandon, he has over 12 hours of time where he doesn't have any recollection whatsoever. And this was occurring during adolescence. And that's very significant from a neuropsychological standpoint because that level of severity is typically correlated with alteration in mood, specifically depression, agitation, and some behavioral disinhibition. And I think all those things were characteristic of that time period for him.
So would you expect would you expect there's a possibility that if you were to do certain tests on him, you would see some certain deficits in his physical function as a result?
Not necessarily in a psychometric standpoint. In other words, if I administer tests that most people might understand as like an IQ test or academic achievement testing, or basically looking at different types of thinking. Our measures are particularly good in the middle ranges. We do a great job of discriminating loss of function in the middle ranges. But if you think about a bell-shaped curve or a Gaussian distribution, when people are on the one end or the other, our measures are not sensitive. The testing that I had available to review that weighed into my decision of whether or not to actually administer tests revealed Brandon to be functioning, at least from an academic standpoint, at a level that's in the 90th percentile. So that's out on the Gaussian distribution. So I didn't feel like psychometric testing would actually reveal much from Brandon. He had some self-reportive symptoms that were consistent with someone who's had an acquired decline in function, but I didn't think the measures that we administer would be sensitive to that.
So there was one test that you were able to administer that told you something, is that correct?
Well, I did administer one test, yes, sir.
Would you explain that to the jury? Why you did that? What were the results?
The one test that I administered was what's called the smell identification test. And the reason that I did that is because the olfactory bulb just goes in the lower part of the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are what are typically injured when you have any kind of blunt force trauma to the head. The loss of sense of smell or the inability to discriminate with smell is sensitive to those kinds of things. So I administered that, and what I found was that Brandon actually, consistent with his own self-report about it, he doesn't discriminate particularly well. He would be classified as microsmic or anosmic, and that just means he can't smell. Now, from a neuropsychological standpoint, that's very significant because that clinically correlates with behavioral disinhibition. It clinically correlates with poor self-control, and it also correlates with mood instability. So all of those things are consistent with what we know about Brandon.
Which, again, tell me those things individually. You said behavioral disinhibition. What does that mean?
We all have impulses, but for our frontal lobes, we would express those impulses, and those are all of our base human desires, cussing, sexual thoughts, all those things. That's all part of our normal biological experience, and our frontal lobes allow us to exert some control over those impulses that everyone has.
And do you see people with this kind of frontal lobe, damage in the frontal lobe, become disinhibited?
Yes.
And what does that mean, disinhibition?
Well, as I used to tell my staff at my facility that I was a clinical director of, if you have any question about how you look today, go ask one of our patients, because they'll tell you. It's really just that they're a little off socially. They not, in many cases, not very dramatically, but they're a little off socially. They tend to have a little bit difficult time in a large social group because they're saying the things that maybe everybody's thinking, but they're the ones that say it.
And so you've seen signs through the smell test that would verify the fact that Brandon has this, to some extent, some frontal lobe deficit.
It raises the index of suspicion. I think our unfortunately with our science, our work, the tests that we would administer themselves are nonspecific. So what my professional role is trying to correlate our behavioral observations with what we know about someone's history, a known medical event, and how that might express itself behaviorally.
And did you say that this incidence of frontal lobe damage and depression are two things that tend to go hand in hand?
Yes.
Explain why that is, and what's your observation?
Well, it has, in part, there's books written on this stuff, and there's still a lot of people arguing about it, and it's the subject of a lot of conversation, but fundamentally, the frontal lobes are at least in part mediated by neurons and neurochemicals that are also involved in mood regulation and sleep regulation and pain regulation. All those things are sort of intertwined. And feelings of sadness, depression, without the awareness of that is basically characteristic of what you would expect to find when someone has a brain injury like that.
So there has been testimony that Brandon's depression really first manifests itself at age 11 or 12. Is that significant from a neuropsychological standpoint?
It is. I think that his depression probably preceded that date, but that's an inference I'm drawing from the things that I looked at. I think he has been struggling with sadness and depression virtually all of his life.
And have you seen records that would indicate any early suicide attempts?
Yes.
And what records are you referring to?
School records mainly.
Do you recall approximately what age that was?
Mostly in adolescence. He had behavioral evidence that he was making gestures of self-harm. He was cutting himself. He was burning himself. He was making explicit statements to the school or to classmates about killing himself.
Are there any, did Brandon report to you himself that he had ever attempted to commit suicide?
He did.
And what kind of occasions are we talking about?
He had a couple of occasions that he mentioned to me. He talked about an event where he, I think the first one that I have noted is at age 16 with an obvious gesture. He basically did what you see in the movies. He closed the garage door, turned on the car, basically tried to commit suicide that way.
Was there an earlier, say around 11 years old, suicide attempt that you're aware of? Or discussion of suicide?
There was a discussion about it. I think there were a number of times when there were statements made in school that led the folks there to believe that he was suicidal.
And do you know whether the family followed up with any kind of psychological or psychiatric treatment?
Unbelievable to me as a father and as a professional. They had the exact opposite statement. They said they were not going to follow up, and at one point threatened to sue the school district.
Okay. Because the school district wanted them to follow up with psychological testing?
Yes, sir.
Or not testing, but psychological treatment?
Yes, sir.
What about when the skateboarding accident occurred? What was the family's response to that?
After the father found Brandon in the garage, confused and disoriented, and he was alarmed enough to take him to the hospital. The recommendation from the record was that they had wanted him to follow up with neurological care, and as far as I know, that did not happen.
Is that important after a major injury like that, to have neurological care?
It is in my estimation, yes, sir.
That's what you do, essentially. Right?
Yes.
What kind of neurological care can be given?
Primarily monitoring and making sure that when there is a disturbance in mood, when there are other things that go on, that they're addressed quickly. Because what oftentimes happens is that people around them make the assumption that they're doing okay because they're walking and talking and making sense of what's going on around them, but in fact they're suffering. They're struggling, and you see a decrement in the ability to focus and concentrate. See deficits in their capacity to regulate their own mood state. You might see problems with sleep regulation. All those things occur.
Okay. But those are things that can at least be monitored, if not dealt with.
They're monitored and dealt with, and appropriate supports are brought to bear on the circumstance.
Okay. Same thing with the young person's depression issues. The young person stating at the late age of 11 that he wants to commit suicide. Is that something that can be dealt with in a psychological treatment kind of context?
Absolutely. It's alarming that it was not dealt with.
And then I believe you indicated there's around age 16 another suicide attempt, running the car in the garage.
Yes, sir.
Any psychological treatment sought for that incident?
No.
And do you know what the family's attitude was toward psychological treatment?
Yes, there was a hostility towards it. They didn't believe in that kind of thing. And I think that's probably a testament to both the mother and the father and the family struggling with their own psychological issues.
So when you went to discuss Brandon and you asked him, hey, do you feel like you're depressed? Did he immediately act like, yes, I'm going to embrace that diagnosis because it might help me?
Not at all.
What was his response?
Typical of someone who's not real aware of their emotional being. I had to approach that subject tangentially because to direct question, he'd pretty much deny it. When you talk about symptoms that are related, and then you come to get to know Brandon a little bit, within that context, you can understand and he'll acknowledge that he's been suffering with depression. And in one of the last interviews I had with him, he acknowledged that he had actually been suffering basically all his life, all he could remember.
And when you asked him, well, why didn't you tell me that you were depressed? Did he say something about his family approach to that?
I didn't ask that question. I asked about treatment, and his statement was, "We don't believe in that thing, that kind of thing."
We don't believe in that kind of thing, referring to psychological treatment.
Yes.
So the whole family attitude is that's something we're going to deal with ourselves.
I think that's right.
How does that, between the severe depression he's suffering from and these frontal lobe injuries, how does that affect predisposition to the substance abuse issues?
When I was going through my training, the head of the Department of Neurology had a saying he would go by. He says, you can have as many diseases as you pleases. And what he tried to get all of us to stop thinking about is whether there was one disease or one event that caused everything. So in some ways, we have two non-mutually exclusive considerations here. He's got a substance abuse disorder, and it's been evident since the 3rd grade. And it could have been the result of multiple concussive events. It could have been exacerbated by multiple concussive events. It could be a separate and distinct problem. In my own estimation, he had a substance abuse problem that he was genetically predisposed to because both of his parents suffer from it. In the context of these multiple concussive events and the fact that he has no psychological support for those difficulties, I think that set the stage for why we are here.
And does the substance abuse itself also have a negative effect on the frontal lobe?
It absolutely does. It can be both an expression of and have its own impact on frontal lobe, especially in children. It can interfere with their development and interfere with the frontal lobes developing. And so this becomes a very problematic context for a young person developing. This is a very, lethal situation.
Right. And the substance abuse that he began at age 12 or 13, what's the parents' role in terms of either putting a stop to that or condoning that, as far as you're interested?
Brandon indicated that he started drinking alcohol from his parents' supply and smoking marijuana obtained from friends at the age in 3rd grade, and he found marijuana at home and smoked that, and even reported that he used drugs with his parents.
What kind of drugs are we talking about?
Mostly marijuana, although at one point I think he did cocaine with his father.
And so what, And for a young person, what does that do in terms of their attitude toward using substances and illegal substances, and what does that do to a person in that stage of development?
Well, it sets the stage for just chronic abusive patterns, and in ways that most of us wouldn't be able to identify with.
Does it seem contradictory that the family seems so hostile to psychiatric intervention, but doesn't have a problem with illegal substance use?
Well, from my point of view as a psychologist, it makes perfect sense that people who are not self-aware and are not very sophisticated from a psychological standpoint would resort to drug use to treat underlying psychiatric conditions.
And we've used the phrase self-medication.
Yes.
Does it seem as though this is likely to be a self-medication situation?
That's the way I would interpret it.
The two drugs that we have heard evidence about Brandon using are ecstasy when he was living in Colorado, and then Xanax after a period of relative sobriety here in Austin. And the Xanax, of course, use led to this particular incident. How are those related in terms of this whole self-medication issue?
Well, I think it's interesting that those drugs both have two things that are relevant in my estimation. Both of them have antidepressant properties, and they both have anxiolytic or anxiety-reducing properties.
Okay. And so if a person's depressed, they might think, I'll take this and it'll make me feel better.
I don't think it's that way. I think it's the reverse. I think they take it and go, oh my God, this feels great. I haven't felt this good ever. And so they want more. That's the way I would interpret it.
Is that because their experience of depression is just so pervasive, they assume that's how the world always is?
That's exactly right.
What do you know about the effect of Xanax on the night of our incident?
What I know is that, and I learned this from the, I guess the incident reports and things, that before Brandon got into the store, 911 had already been called, and that his behavior, characterized by everyone who saw him, was that he was intoxicated. And
let me stop you. What you said was before Brandon got into the store, 911 was called.
that's my understanding, yes, sir.
Okay. So the evidence was that he went to the store, had been in, and then left, and when he came back in, that's when 911.
I may have that wrong. I may have it wrong.
Fair enough. But he's making a spectacle of himself.
That's right.
So
He got everybody's, the take-home message is he got everybody's attention.
Okay. And is that consistent with a use of a large quantity of Xanax?
It certainly can be.
What does that do to a person's ability to regulate their behavior, one might say?
Well, Xanax, and actually that entire class of medications, is significant in a number of ways, not the least of which is it in of itself disinhibits someone. It's a lot like alcohol in that regard. You see people lose their inhibitions when they drink high quantities of alcohol. This is really not a lot different. There's a very significant disinhibiting property to the medication, especially when it's at an abusive level. And the other thing is that it has amnestic properties. And so those things really make it kind of an awful drug to abuse from a behavioral standpoint.
What about impulse control? Is that affected by Xanax?
Yes, it is.
And a person might argue that just because your impulse control is impaired, that the actions you're taking are actions that you might actually really want to take. It's just that you have removed your filtering ability. Is that a fair question?
Not in my estimation. We all have impulses. And our nervous system in a lot of ways is very primitive in the sense that everybody's probably heard of a fight-flight reaction or response that people have. That's really a testament to how primitive our nervous system is. That's how we register the world and our interactions with the world. If you're in a circumstance where you're disinhibited, your actions are likely to be primitive, and they're likely to be along that continuum, either a flight or fight mode.
So when we're trying to, in this case, make sense of the senseless,
Yes,
because this is unquestionably a senseless act.
it is.
Is that consistent with a person having taken a huge dose of Xanax and being senseless?
Of course, we know that from retrospect, so we know that was the circumstance. That's one way to make sense out of, or at least to come to understand why this happened and why we're all
not
here.
trying to justify it.
No, not at all.
But is there any question in your mind, based on those on the alprazolam blood levels, that Brandon Daniel did not possess the full range of his faculties at that night?
In a profound way. His blood levels were toxic 7 hours after, I believe. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about a drug that is metabolized quickly and typically has a pretty small half-life relative to other drugs in that category. And so you would expect him to get rid of it all. It's astonishing to me that he was out and about moving, but that's a testament to chronic substance abuse too. Our tolerance grows so high that you can abuse an astonishing amount of substances that would probably put us to sleep or kill us.
Right. Now, we can't argue that Brandon somehow involuntarily took those substances. It's not what we're trying to argue.
No, I wouldn't want to confuse anybody about that either.
Right. What we're trying to do, though, is explain how he got to be in that particular position, although we can't really explain why he took that particular action. Would you say that's fair?
I do think that's fair.
We have discussed the linkage between depression and intelligence. Because you look at Brandon and you think, that is such a bright, intelligent fellow. How could he possibly be depressed? Are those two things linked in any way?
Not at all. Depression is an equal opportunity disease. It affects a lot of people.
What about the frontal lobe damage, like the loss of smell and the disinhibition? Does that coincide with a loss of intelligence?
Not at all. A lot of people have heard of psychosurgery or frontal lobotomies. For many years, we didn't think the frontal lobes really did anything, so we cavalierly ablated them when there were intractable psychiatric conditions. It was only after they'd done a good deal of those, and those extended, by the way, into the early 60s. We didn't think the frontal lobes really did a whole lot. Of course, now we feel real differently about all that, but early on and our understanding of these things, frontal lobes were not really considered to be related at all to intelligence.
So could Brandon's a slight deficiency in frontal lobes, like Brandon may have, could that help to explain why he says rude things?
Yes.
And doesn't consider what other people might think about the effect on them of what he's saying?
I think, yes.
And why is that?
The frontal circuitry, it basically, in a sense, receives inputs from virtually all other parts of the brain and sends outputs to virtually all other parts of the brain. So we know it has some role in monitoring our internal state, monitoring our behavior, regulating it, controlling it, and executing things. When that's not working properly, there's a disinhibition that occurs. There's a behavioral instability that occurs.
Well, it's kind of like the story you told earlier, where if you really want to know how you're looking today, you ask the neurological patients because they'll tell you.
Exactly.
Even if it's not something that would be very nice to say.
That's right. I think in this particular case too, these are not singly determinant factors. And what I mean by that is there's a lot going on here. He's got this neurologically significant history that you shouldn't trivialize. In the context of someone who's been struggling with depression and other psychiatric difficulties all of his life, that's exacerbated by the context of his life, the family, and their own problems with substance abuse and Brandon's substance abuse disorder. All of those things are factors here.
And in order to make a diagnosis of what kind of psychiatric issue he has, are you just relying on what Brandon told you?
No, I'm relying on all the records I had available.
Were you able to review the Travis County Sheriff's Office own medical records?
Yes,
And do you recall what they reflect in terms of the Sheriff's Office diagnosis of Brandon?
yes.
And can you relate that?
They diagnosed him with a major depressive disorder as the primary diagnosis, and then a polysubstance abuse and abuse disorder, and I think anxiety disorder and OS as well.
Okay. And that's not some defense hired expert hired gun or something. That's the Sheriff's Office own psychiatrist.
That's right.
You know if it was Dr. Wagner, you recall what the name of the doctor was?
I don't recall the name of the doctor, but I believe that might be it. I don't know.
Fair enough. In terms of treating folks who have this frontal lobe damage, do you have particular expertise in the kinds of environments that are helpful for treating folks with that kind of frontal lobe damage?
Yes.
In fact, last weekend, did you present something that bears on that particular issue?
Yeah, I did a lecture last Saturday, but and it dealt with traumatic brain injury, and the subtext of it was to PhD students. The subtext of it was environmentally contingent functionality, which is a mouthful, but essentially what it was talking about was when you have a neurologically involved patient, we don't fix that. So how you improve functionality, improve quality of life, diminish the expression of the problem is creating an environment where someone is successful, which usually means imposing a good deal of structure and support around them so that they can be successful.
So that brings up a couple of questions. Number one, through your evaluation of Brandon, is it your sense that he is so terribly damaged with his frontal lobe that he's just incapable of controlling his behavior?
No.
There's some deficit there.
Yes.
But not such deficit he just can't control himself, right?
That would be my opinion, yes, sir.
But even with those deficits that he has, is it possible for a person to grow past those deficits and learn to make adaptations in their life?
I think so. I mean, the disease states, including neurological injury, doesn't rob someone of their humanity. And essentially, we're all on our own developmental trajectory that will take us to the end of our lives. And Brendan's no different. And so...
we just be restricted to giving an opinion about scientific evidence and not give his personal opinion about someone's humanity.
The witnesses testifying about his trajectory of recovery from this traumatic brain injury. That's his exact area of expertise.
As to this defendant.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. As to this defendant, yes.
So, thank you. So you were talking about everybody has their
What?
own trajectory of. So how does that relate to Brandon?
Where I was going with that is essentially that over time, and I think this is evident just taking a small retrospective look about the last year, I think there will be growth, development, adjustment, and there will be, all of us, Brandon's no different, the desire to make some kind of contribution. And I think in this context, I think that he in fact can adjust to where he is and can make a contribution and will develop.
And we know, because Brandon's been convicted of capital murder, that he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison.
Yes.
Either in a general population situation on death row, he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, both very structured environments. How does that bear on a person with the neurological issues that you talked about?
Given the structure and the routine, I actually think Brandon will do okay.
Ron, we'll pass it. Oh, I'm sorry, one more.
Dr. I'm going to show you some records that I believe you had previously reviewed. Do you recall having reviewed this particular record?
Yes.
And this record deals with a particular incident.
Yes.
And what particular incident is the record referring to?
It's the skateboard incident that we talked about.
And the records that you reviewed about that incident are from what facility?
Centennial Health One Centennial Medical Plaza.
And what is it your recollection the medical records reflect? In terms of what happened to him, was there concussion, loss of consciousness?
Well, the record reflects that he had a slip fall accident, striking his head on the concrete and loss of consciousness. He came to and had an extended period of confusion, and he's lost memories, like I discussed, before the accident and after the accident, and he was intermittently amnestic and confused. And they've identified it as having a traumatic brain injury, closed head injury, they referred to it, but that's not the language we commonly use. We'll use a traumatic brain injury.
And this is from when he was 15 years old?
Yes,
And that's the same incident that you've testified to?
that's right.
So you're not just taking Brandon's word for it, you have actual records from the hospital?
That's right.
Your Honor, we'll pass it.
Sir, did you bring the information that you reviewed in order to prepare for your testimony? May I approach the witness, sir? You did.
I brought reference to it. A lot of it was electronic, but you're welcome to look
You
at
didn't
it.
bring the actual material?
I'm sorry?
You didn't bring the actual material that you reviewed?
No, it was conveyed to me electronically, but I have my
I know
notes
what
on
it
the
was
subject.
electronically, but you could have made copies of it, right?
Well, I had probably over 10,000 pages of records, so I did not bring them all, no, sir.
And this is all you brought?
Yeah, it's 2 timelines and then my own notes. So you're welcome to look at it.
Can I take this too?
Of course.
Brandon, do we want to take some time?
How much material is it? Maybe the material that you reviewed electronically, did you send?
I didn't hear.
She was asking if you could send that material to me that you reviewed,
course.
the electronic material.
Certainly.
So we're going to recess for the evening to allow them to review that information. We'll see you at 9 o'clock tomorrow.
Let me just give you my card.
You know,
Might be easier. Bring a zip drive or something.